One, two, three. Okay, great. Good morning to everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for accepting our invitation to be here with us in person in Brussels. Also, let me welcome all of you who are watching us online or will be watching us online afterwards. I'm Ernest Wyciszkiewicz, the head of Mieroszewski Center. This is our first premiere event here in Brussels. So as a newcomer, let me steal 2 or 3 minutes of your time and explain who we are, what we do, and why we are here. And then we will move to our today's discussion, which will be related to, which will be about the topic undefeated Russia. Are we ready? We mean Europe, the West, to foot the bill. So Mieroszewski Center is a public Polish institution based in Warsaw. We were established by the Act of Polish Parliament 12 years ago. And our mission is quite simple, to foster dialogue between Poles and our eastern neighbors, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, also Georgians and Moldovans. This is what we do. I would call it a sort of part of Polish public diplomacy in a general sense. How we do it, we are sort of a hybrid kind of institution, meaning that we combine functions of a research, classical research institution doing some scientific projects, most related to history, but not only. We do a lot of public opinion polls, not ourselves, but by commissioning them, so trying to understand what are the public attitudes towards each other between Poles and neighbors I mentioned. We have a publishing house. We organize seminars, workshops, summer schools, trainings for translators. We provide grants for other institutions who want to do something along this mission. So this is mostly how we try to achieve our general objective to move things going in terms of dialogue between Poles and the peoples I mentioned. Obviously, after 2022, there are some caveats. So on one hand, it's understandable that Ukraine and Ukrainians need much more help and support now than beforehand. And that is what we are trying to do. And on the other hand, it's obvious that it's not possible right now to work with, for instance, Russian public institutions or Belarusian public institutions. So we are focused on working with those Belarusians who actually had to leave the country. As many of them right now are in Poland or in Lithuania. And the same applies to the Russians, who actually, most of them with whom we actually did some projects beforehand were forced to leave the country, and now they are not just in Poland, but mostly in other Western countries. So we decided to focus our attention to those from these two groups who actually openly condemned what happened and this barbaric, brutal aggression against Ukraine, because we think that this is a must right now in order to think about common future. And why we're here, it's quite simple. I mean, yesterday we had a good news coming from European Commission that Ukraine and Georgia had positive recommendation when it comes to entering negotiations. Georgia received candidate status. So it tells us that we are in sort of inflection point, not just because of the war, obviously, but of other processes that are happening all over the place. And we, the center, would like to use this opportunity and add something to this debate. And also there's a practical reasons. We have a Brussels contact here, direct Brussels contact, Bartek Gajos. If you are interested in anything about the center and cooperation, please, I mean, he's the guy. You can write, call, and have a conversation about potential collaboration. So I'm using also his presence here to develop our projects here in Brussels. But now to the point. Undefeated Russia. is Europe ready to foot the bill? Before I introduce our speakers, excellent speakers, just a few words, because we proposed the topic, so let me explain why. I have a feeling that we have been in sort of a never-ending debate from 2022 that oscillates around such phrases like diplomatic solution, like peace negotiations, settlement. So we have this positive framing of that kind of potential solutions of the war that Russia started. Even last year, there was a famous report of excellent European think tank, a great report, but which produced sort of the division in Europe, dividing people here in a peace camp and justice camp. The justice was sort of euphemism, because if you have peace camp, then obviously the other camp is a war camp. So you have this positive framing of trying to find a solution to the conflict. On the other hand, why? Because we have this another set of phrases that actually define the debate, that like nuclear escalation, like even Third World War coming, like potential chaos in Russia leading to someone even worse than Putin coming to power. So very often people use this this first positive framing to drive public imagination towards potential possible solutions to this potential extremely negative scenarios. So my idea was just to reframe this debate a little bit, which is not obviously nothing original. People by the table were doing this also as well in their reports or on Twitter feeds, whatever. But I think that we lack this. So, and the public is driven by that kind of phraseology and not by the question, okay, and what if we let Russia go unpunished? What if we let them feel that they won? What cost would it mean? Because there would be definitely costs, economic costs, strategic costs, military costs, social costs to that. So let's focus on that. Let's try to think a little bit different way on the same problem. So together with me are, starting from my left here, Keir Giles, senior fellow with Chatham House Russia Eurasian program, with a lot of experience in other professional duties in his more than 20 years of Russia watching. What I would like to recommend to you especially is his last two books, Moscow Rules and the fresh one, Russia's War on everyone. Why? Because if you want to understand how the Russian elite thinks and why it is different than we think it is, he put Russian elite on the couch and dissected their way of thinking in a very methodical way. So I can recommend it to all of you. It gave me a lot of food for thought. Though in Poland, maybe it's not a surprise, but still, I think it's very useful to understand why Russia, as it is today with Putin in power, is a bit different than we think. Then we have Nona Michelidze, senior fellow at Italian Institute of International Affairs, well-known experts on EU neighborhood, Russia, frequent contributor to Italian media. So I'm happy to have someone from the south of Europe to understand, to let us know how the same problem is perceived in Italy, and what solutions are proposed there when it comes to dealing with Russia and with its aggression against Ukraine. And last but not least, Mart Kuldekap, a professor of history, of Estonian Northern history and politics at University College London, from Estonia originally, so we will have this Baltic perspective, but also a frequent contributor to the debate on security and foreign policy in our region. So, what are we ready? Are we ready? Are we aware of potential costs that might be might be the result of letting Russia go with a sense of triumph after this war. What do you think? Just 5 to 7 minutes kickoff, and then a little bit more discussion among us, and then of course you are all invited to ask your questions and comments. So please go ahead, maybe starting from my left here.
Sure, thank you. Normally in this situation, we start off by thanking the hosts. And yes, of course, I'm very grateful to Ernest, and it's a privilege to be here for the first iteration of their events in Brussels. I have to say I'm also profoundly depressed to be here, because the answer to your question, of course, are we ready, is no, and that's why you've asked us to be here. The whole reason for bringing us in is because of an appalling failure not only of policy but also of communication among Western states, not getting across the real implications of what this war is about and what happens if it is not prosecuted to a successful conclusion. There's been a calamitous dereliction of duty in Western capitals, most of them to the west of Warsaw, in recognizing and responding to and explaining to their voters just what exactly is at stake in this conflict. And it has been misrepresented to people across the continent and beyond. And the result of that, of course, is that voters are not prepared for the fact that this is going to be a long war and a costly war, and one for which there is no resolution of the kind that you were describing, because Russia's aims are entirely incompatible with any kind of peaceful resolution. There is no middle ground between Moscow that wants to exterminate one of its neighboring countries and that neighboring country that would actually quite prefer to survive. And this is just one of the aspects that has not been properly communicated to people across the West. It's still presented as a problem that is to do with Ukraine, as opposed to Ukraine being just the front line in a much broader, in a global conflict in which the future of Europe is in fact at stake. It's still presented as something which you can opt out of, but the war is already on. It already involves us whether we like it or not. It may take two to tango. It does not take two to actually start a conflict. And if you ignore the fact that Russia has been at war with Europe for the last 10 years and continue to do so even after that has opened into direct and immediate high-intensity combat, then you are setting yourself up for catastrophic defeat. Now, Ernest gave us quite a challenge. He asked us to talk about the costs of leaving Russia undefeated in all of those different areas, economic, military, social, political, but only gave us 7 minutes to talk about it. And that is a problem, because the laundry list of disastrous consequences of leaving Russia in a position where it does not realize that it was a terrible strategic blunder to invade Ukraine is far, far longer than 7 minutes. So what I propose to do is generalize a little, talk a little bit about the situation that we are in at the moment, and then save the specifics either for my fellow panelists or for when we have Q&A a little bit later on to dig into some of the detail. Because it's worth stopping and thinking about where we are. So we face a militant, aggressive country which is driven by a generation that's been reared on grievance and the belief in their right and in fact in their duty to conquer and enslave other countries through terror and through force of arms in order to resurrect their empire. And so they've embarked on a campaign of conquest and genocide. This should not have been a surprise. At the end of the last decade and the beginning of this, when trying to characterize the situation we were in with the looming threat from Russia, we talked about the situation being like Europe in 1938, when you had a state which had very similar characteristics preparing to embark on a similar campaign of conquest. But the key difference was, in 1938, Britain, France, other countries had started their crash program of rearmament, reinvesting in defense, spooling up their defense industry so that they were not completely defenseless when the cataclysm came. That hasn't happened. And things have moved on. We are now in early September 1939 because the war has started. And yet, Europe is still not responding in a way that will prepare it to defend itself. There has not been the injection of capital and political will into defense spending. There has not, with the honorable exception of Poland, been the recognition of what this means for defense budgets if you're not to leave yourself entirely defenseless. there has been a series of decisions not to deter Russia, which, as always with Russia, is an invitation to still further excesses. What happens if that continues? What happens if Russia does not come away from what it is doing in Ukraine, convinced that it was a terrible mistake? Well, Russia will be convinced yet again, as it has been so many in the past, that open military aggression is the right way to address its disagreement with its neighbors. It will also conclude that nuclear intimidation works because of the way in which it has constrained key Western partners, particularly the United States, from giving their full support to Ukraine. And it's not just in Europe. It's not just the non-NATO countries that are at risk, it's also the rest of the world, where other countries will learn from what Russia has achieved and learn that military aggression will go unpunished, that the rules-based international order will not be defended, and that the West can be defeated. And furthermore, if you have nuclear weapons or can acquire them, this gives you a get-out-of-jail-free card for avoiding the consequences. People west of Warsaw have a tendency to think that they are safe, but that is largely because they have not listened to what President Putin has said about his ambition. He's laid out very clearly what he thinks is his program of correcting historical mistakes of 100 years ago, those mistakes that he said led to eventually the creation of the countries around Russia's periphery that we think of as sovereign, independent nations, and he thinks of as historical accidents that really should be part of the Russian Empire. The problem with that is it's not just non-NATO countries, it's also those that are full-fledged members of NATO and the EU. And there, again, we have a circumstance where Putin's view of the world, and it is shared by a very large proportion of the Russian population, is incompatible with peace and security in Europe. So there's been an opportunity missed to bring peace and stability to Europe so far, and we continue to miss it. And you have to ask the question, there is this single external security threat to Europe. Do we want to resolve it, or do we want to make it worse? Appeasing it will make it worse, as it has done so many times before. Leaves you with the question, of course, of how exactly could you resolve it? A few years ago, we had an unusually frank conversation with the number 2 in the Russian embassy in London, who was about to leave, about to go back to Moscow, I think was demob happy and was quite content to discuss with us, we think, quite openly how he felt about the world situation that was deteriorating fairly rapidly already. We touched on this question of how do you make Russia a country that is not so intent on invading and dominating neighbors and does not see military conquest as an acceptable means to resolve disputes between countries. His answer was very simple. He said, you, meaning the Western Alliance, need to do to Russia what you did to Germany and Japan. Defeat it militarily, a savage, crushing defeat, bomb it flat, occupy it for a number of decades, replace entirely its political system, its educational system, its constitution, remain in supervising role within the country for a number of generations until it has become a different country, and then you will have a Russia that can live in peace with its neighbors. It's a great plan, but it's never going to happen. So we are faced with the alternative, and the alternative is now, as it has been, ever since the revival of Russian interest in asserting itself beyond its borders, trying to contain the damage, trying to reduce the opportunities through which Russia can cause harm to its neighbors and to those countries it perceives as adversaries further afield, whether those countries recognize or not that they are targets. That requires substantial investment in the capabilities to do so, and that substantial investment should have happened when the early warning signs were visible. It is by now late, and the only hope is that it is not too late to rescue Europe from the threat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nona, please.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank you for organizing this event, for having me here. And second, let me congratulate the people of Ukraine with yesterday's decision by the Commission to recommend the Council to open the accession talks with Ukraine. It's amazing how the country, despite the war, despite the tragedies they are suffering, still the people keeps the implementation of the reforms dynamic. And it's also symbolic that 10 years ago, Euromaidan started in November, and 10 years after, Ukraine has such progress, and it's and that it is nearest to the European family. Now, why I agree all the things Kiara just told us. Let me also just start with where we are right now, but let me look at this on a different angles. And I think that we are now in a stark reality, what has been described by General Zaluzhny in his latest article given to The Economist, when on the one hand you have this positional war with a perspective to be transformed in protracted stalemate, which in the long run favors Russia, and on the other hand we all are surrounded with these talks or discussions about the Western war fatigue. No, and you may know what happened several days ago in Italy, the scandal with two Russian comedians calling Prime Minister Meloni, and Meloni thinking that she was speaking with the African Union's leader, said that there is a certain war fatigue among the leaders of Europe. A year ago, General Zaluzhny gave the interview to the same Economist, making a list of the things he needed in order to make the then upcoming counteroffensive successful. He said, I need that number of tanks, I need long-range missile in order to hit Russian supply and logistic lines, I need strong air defense, I need air superiority. The West gave maybe 1/3 what was requested, but mostly, I mean, the US itself kept the veto up until recently on ATACMS. Germany remains still skeptical or dubious about the system like Taurus to make a considerable impact in order to change the course of war. Bearing in mind that Europe has its own problems with the production of ammunition for the artillery fire, still the reality is that the West conceded 7-9 months to Russia to dig and to prepare for fortifications, and now we have this counteroffensive which is sluggish, and we have now these talks about the Western war fatigues. Now, Russia, in its effort to describe counteroffensive as a failure, started this kind of suicidal and costly attack under Avdiivka and Vuhledar. And as a result, October has been the bloodiest month for the Russian army, actually, but they are ready to pay this price. But despite of this, it seems that Russia is somehow succeeding in its informational warfare, now we're disseminating all the articles about the need of negotiations with Putin. However, what I believe is that we have to do something not with the actual Western war fatigue, but with the fact that the Western strategy, which is let make Ukraine survive but not to win, hit the dead end. I think it's over. And with this counteroffensive, being in this situation, it should be clear that that strategy is over. And the strategy was flawed since the beginning when applied to Ukraine, and because Ukraine has a problem with the manpower. also in the perspective, all in comparison with Russia that has that kind of resources. And I think that the other problem that is connected to this strategy is the wrong thinking of the West that the Ukrainian resistance would somehow compel the Kremlin that the victory it wants to obtain in Ukraine is impossible. So somehow Kremlin would engage Ukraine in the negotiations, because there are problems around the negotiations, that the kind of negotiation Russia wants to obtain from Ukraine. Because if the West really thinks to push Ukraine towards the negotiation, it means it fails to understand the very nature of the conflict. Because if one of the party of the conflict, Ukraine in this case, perceived the war as a genocide, as an objective of one country to erase identity of the other and to subjugate the country completely, to push that country towards the negotiation, which often refers as give the land in exchange of peace, it's impossible task. Yet the West fails to understand this. Another thing the West does not take into the consideration is actually the capacity of Ukraine to escalate when they sense betrayal. And the example of this, what happened at the last NATO summit, when the Western leaders failed to extend the invitation for Ukraine into NATO membership, and we saw how reacted the Ukrainian delegation. We saw that press conference with Jack Sullivan confronting the civil society representatives from Ukraine. It has been difficult diplomatic moment between the US and Ukraine. So it will not be easy just to blackmail Ukraine. We will not give you the weapons, so you are first to negotiate. And another thing I think that the West missed completely when hopes for negotiation has something to do with Russia. It is somehow built on the false assumption that Russia and Putin are willing to negotiate and would welcome an end of the war. Because for Russia now and for Putin now, the only possible way to maintain the power is a never-ending war, even at low intensity, but still the war has to go on. In that sense, I think that the war, actually the need of war emerged already in 2019, 2020. In Russia, it emerged with the problems with the pension reforms, constitutional reforms, and then you have Navalny poisoning, his return in Russia, his imprisonment. You had the problems with the further restriction of civil liberties with all this law on foreign agents and undesired organization. We had in Russia for several months protests in Khabarovsk, Sergei Furgal case. And then they had the COVID-19 pandemic with highest death toll and with all the social and economic consequences. And this was precisely the time when the famous article on national unity of Ukraine and Russia was published by Putin. So it was already clear that back then the war was a necessity for them. Now, if Putin ends the war, it means that it has to face not only pre-war existing social, economic, political problems, but it has to face also the political, economic problems which derive from the war now and from the sanctions the West imposed on Russia. So bearing this context in mind, I think that there is no other strategy left for the West than to bet for victory in Ukraine and to give Ukraine all this thing it can give. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mart, being an Estonian, you probably could tell us more about how would Estonians feel if Russia would go but unpunished at all after this conflict, after this war. Please, floor is yours.
Thanks. First of all, thank you for inviting me as well. It's a great pleasure to be here. And as I told my other panelists before this event, we are probably not going to disagree with each other very much. And this is indeed the case. So we have pretty much reached the point of agreement, and everything I'm going to say is just maybe putting some of these points in a slightly different way. We're dealing with many complicated things here, and as Keir was saying, though, the question in the title of our event, is Europe ready to foot the bill, is, I mean, the answer is obviously no. This is not a complicated question. This is the starting point of our discussion. Europe is not ready to fight, as Europe has demonstrated over the last 2 years, but it is also not ready to face the consequences of the fight being lost, whether it is participating in the fight or not. Now, I'm not actually going to say that much about the Baltics or Estonia specifically, because I think just as this is not just about Ukraine, it's not about the Baltics either. This is not about regional security, it's about European security and international security. And I self-identify as a historian, so I would like to put my historian's hat on now and point out a couple of things from that point of view, which I think are important to keep in mind. Firstly, undefeated Russia isn't some hypothetical, never-before-seen scenario that should be hard to imagine for us, because Russia has been left undefeated before, after its war of aggression against Georgia in 2008, after the annexation of Crimea and instigation of war in Donbass and occupation in 2014. And these are just some recent examples. We can also say that Russia was left substantially undefeated after the Cold War. It was allowed to keep the USSR's seat in the UN Security Council. It was allowed to go on lecturing the West about its supposed security concerns vis-à-vis its neighbors. And it was allowed to keep all the legacy capabilities of a global superpower that had been preparing for a World War III for many decades. And now these capabilities are being used to murder Ukrainians as we speak. But perhaps most importantly, Russia kept its revanchist mindset, shrouding imperialism, colonialism in a discourse of perpetual self-victimization. So we know the likely outcome of Russian impunity, and we know it well. It is the continuation and escalation of Russian aggression, not just against its own people, not just against its neighbors, unlucky as they might be, but also against the rules-based international system, because the rules-based international system keeps hinting that these rules don't actually matter. But secondly, and this is also something I think we should keep in mind, past experience is not a perfect guide to the future. We might assume that if Russia wins now, what we're going to see is yet another Georgia after 2008, or yet another Ukraine after 2014. Or in other words, yet another frozen conflict that is certainly awful for everybody who is murdered, who is tortured, who is raped in the occupied territories, but at least the others will live, ourselves very much included. But in the end, we need to keep in mind there is only so much resilience in our institutions, in our laws, in our societies. And Hemingway, the famous writer, said that a person goes bankrupt in two ways, first gradually and then all at once. If by far the largest and most vicious war in Europe after the Second World War is allowed to be won by the aggressor, there is a good chance that the consequences of this victory will not just be more gradual decline of the kind that we're already used to, but there is a good chance that they will be exponentially more drastic than anything else we have seen ever since the end of the Second World War. And this is not just hypothetical either. A global polycrisis is unfolding already as we speak, with actors around the world sensing an opportunity to put their own imperialist and genocidal agendas in practice. And why did it sense this opportunity? Because over the last 2 years, the West has shown itself to be weak, has shown itself to be indecisive and unserious. And this is why I would say that Russia's victory would be a moral disaster for the Western societies, proving beyond any doubt that the West is nothing else but weak, indecisive, and unserious. And to collectively admit that this is indeed the case is to undo the liberal internationalist world that, for all its various blind spots that we need to acknowledge, has still brought unprecedented prosperity, safety, and liberty to millions of people who've been lucky enough to be governed by it. And I will finish by saying that most people around the world know firsthand what it's like to be without all of these things. Everybody born in the Soviet Union, like I was, knows what it's like to be without these things. But joining them in this knowledge, however, is going to help neither them nor ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you all. It is by purpose why we have some like-minded people by the table, because then now I would like to ask more difficult question to all of you, actually, because it's easy to meet in our Russia watching bubble and to agree upon everything. It's easy because things are obvious to us. Things, and I might also have a problem because I think that those things should be obvious to everybody, but they're not. Like, for instance, that people think that Russia really wants to end the war. No, Russia wants to win the war. That's the purpose. Russia doesn't want to win the war with Ukraine only. Russia wants to win the war with the West, because Russia is at war with the West, not since 2022, not even since 2014, but even longer. And on various, Keir enumerated dozens, if not even more, examples in his books about how Russia tried to influence situation in the West using various measures and techniques and methods, and it was all over the press, all over the Europe. And why it is so hard for us, whose job actually is also to convey this message to the public, and to convince the people and those who make decisions that there is truly an inflection point right now ahead of us, and decisions that we will take right now would have a profound impact on the future of the European Union and Europe and the European security and international security as well. Another point is that when I'm looking at public opinion polls in Europe, they're not that bad, actually, if you compare them to things 3 years ago. So the people know, the people feel there is something wrong with Russia. They might not understand deeply the historical reasons and other roots of that, but they know that something is going on. So it's not just that public is quote unquote pro-Russian and policymakers reflect these attitudes. No, not at all. I feel that there is something else that plays out, and I don't know what. If you could just try to answer this question, I would be grateful.
Well, given my long track record of total failure in convincing anybody that there is actually a problem, yes, I'm well qualified to speak about why it doesn't work. It's not an accident that we're all on the same page. One of the most striking things about the situation that we have at the moment is the consensus that you have among anybody, any group of people that have studied the Russia problem, understood what the Kremlin is, looked at European security for more than the course of the current war. Everybody is on more or less the same page. And yet it is incredibly hard to break out of that bubble, as you called it, to get the message across, to achieve that breakthrough to particularly policymakers. And one of the things that that I've encountered over and over again, one of the obstacles to actually getting that message across, is the fact that what we're observing now is so abnormal and unnatural for European and to some extent US decision makers, politicians, diplomats, elected officials, because they have spent their education, their careers, their political lives in a bubble of their own, in a political environment to which the way in which Russia operates is entirely alien and completely incomprehensible. And so it becomes extremely hard for them to suspend disbelief, to set aside all of the assumptions that have driven their entire careers about how people interact between each other and how countries interact between each other, and recognize that Russia is actually a case apart, one that is not explained by even international relations theory if you're an academic, any of the normal rules of behavior between countries. The problem is that unless and until you do, in fact, abandon all of those preconceptions about how countries operate, there is no hope of understanding that Russia does not work by those rules. And it's one of the One of the guiding principles that we've been trying to put across for a couple of decades now, ever since this problem started to loom, that it's absolutely essential to abandon the phrase, Russia wouldn't do that, it doesn't make sense. Because what makes sense to people who are in Brussels or in Washington is not what makes sense when you're looking at the same problem from the Kremlin. And that is the absolutely first step in trying to understand what Russia does, why it does it, and therefore realize what needs to be done in response.
Yeah, thank you. Nonna.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also speaking from the Italian perspective now, but it is true for the whole West. I think the most difficult thing was and is to accept that Western rationality has nothing to do with the Russian rationality, and that the Russian government has its own mindset and acts in the framework of that mindset, which has been shaped by the history, colonial history, by the different kind of ideologies of Eurasianism and so on and so on. The second thing is that the threat perception. No, it has been problem since 2014 because the war began in 2014. But Italy, for example, never ever perceived Russia as a threat. They used to look at Baltic state, at Poland, at the all post-Soviet states, like throw them playing victims. Those with the kind of the colonial syndromes, and they were never ever taking into consideration seriously the threat perception those countries had towards Russia. This somehow, so that's why I mean large scale invasion was a great shock in Italy. But somehow now they think that, okay, Ukraine has always been, in their perception, under the Russian influence, but Russia would be never be able to hit the NATO. So they are absolutely sure on this, that when you say if we don't defeat Russia now in Ukraine, it moves further, it will challenge the security of Baltic states. This is something that they don't really believe. And you're right when you speak about the public opinion. Italy, even if it has been the most difficult case in Europe as kind of being the most pro-Russian, Russian-friendly society, and it has its history because of the Italian Communist Party and its relations with the Soviet Union, all the things you want. But still, I mean, if you look at the Eurobarometer of the European Parliament, which every single 3 months is conducting this survey, I mean, the polls are the same as it were a year ago. Now you have this in Italy, for example, 60% that thinks that you have to support to Ukraine, and including the military support. And there is still this support. I think what is happening is somehow that some experts, also those who are kind of pro-Ukraine, are creating these self-defeating narratives also, around the counteroffensive, around this illusion about undefeated Russia. And then the problem we have, this absence of strategy about post-Putin Russia. And I would also kind of the Western arrogance to think that it is really able to control the situation, to prevent or to manage chaos in Russia.
Mart.
Thanks. There is a very funny saying that if you don't study history, you're bound to repeat it. But if you do study history, you will sit in the sidelines and watch everyone else repeat it. And this, in a way, relates to what Kir was saying about bubbles and how politicians exist in one of them and experts exist in another one of them, and the general public doesn't know who to listen to and who to trust. In the end, to give them the ability to, make sure who's a trust, we need to educate the general public in a way that I think has been neglected, at least in Western Europe and in maybe the collective West more generally. It is a problem of education, it is a problem of experience, and this is one of the reasons why I think the attitudes you can see in most of Eastern Europe, you can see in countries that are Russia's immediate neighbors, differ from those you can see in Western Europe. In Western Europe, there is a very deeply entrenched idea that Nona was also alluding to, that security concerns don't travel across the continent. That what we are seeing now is some kind of a regional security problem. It is between Russia, it is between Ukraine, maybe it also concerns some other states. But you go further westwards and the security concerns peter out. It's got nothing to do with us. This is one thing. The other thing I think is problematic is that most people don't realize what war is, or rather they don't have the ability to imagine the full specter of different wars that do actually exist in reality. People in the West, they can imagine a war that takes place somewhere else on the other side of the world that doesn't actually concern us, that is about people that we know little about. And the only way we can relate to it is through some kind of idea of humanitarian aid, taking in refugees, peace building, inviting the leaders of whatever warring factions we're dealing with to Europe to iron out their differences. Or people in the West, they can imagine an all-out nuclear World War III. Everything, collapses, the world as we know it. I don't know whether it comes from sort of ideas about the Cold War and what would have happened if it had turned hot, or whether it comes from somewhere else. But people can imagine that kind of war. What they can't imagine, and this is a serious problem, they can't imagine the kind of war that has been most common in European history, the kind of interstate war that doesn't immediately, pull everyone else into fighting, but still has grave consequences for European security and international security as a whole. So the other European states also have a very strong interest in this war having one kind of outcome over the other. And so I think trying to explain people some fundamental things about war, about geopolitics, about history is important, and maybe one of the reasons why we don't have the understanding in the West today.
Thank you. Now it's time for you, so I'm opening the floor. Please introduce yourself before you take a floor, gentlemen here, and then.
Thank you very much for very.
Do we need a mic? Do we need a mic here? Yeah.
I can speak quite loudly.
For streaming, I think.
Okay.
Or you can take mine. Oh, maybe that's.
Thank you very much for a very interesting introduction. I think that it's not only Europe which is not ready to foot the bill, but also we see American administration is also experiencing problem in paying the bill. I think that until the end of the year, there is only 1.1 billion left for Ukraine, and after that, it is catastrophe. And with the presidential elections coming, it is becoming even more difficult to convince Americans to pay more for Ukraine. And the second problem, I think that Russia tries to make the Europe or send the message to the West that if you don't stop supporting Ukraine, I will create you problems in other parts of the world. And we see that in the Middle East, we see that in Central Africa, where Russia squeezed France from quite important part of its former colonies. We see also Russia now advances in the South Caucasus, pushing Pashinyan, and we see also alliances, like dictatorial alliances are also working. We see Russia, Turkey, Russia, China. China is, on the shadow, but we see that one of the beneficiaries, biggest beneficiaries of what's happening in the world in Ukraine is also China. So, and we see also Western media recently, like wave of articles criticizing Ukraine for corruption, the conflict between Zaluzhny and Zelensky, and many things. Like the West prepares Ukraine that either you start negotiating with Russia. It is like the message given from different angles. We see pro-democratic media, which gives the message that you are not able to win the war. Start talking, but also from Republican part, and so that plus we see on the ground also this strong internal confrontation between military and political circles in Ukraine, like Zaluzhny, Zelensky, as I said, but also recent killing of Zaluzhny advisors, which was also increased further tension between military and political wing. So can Russia create even more problem than they have already created? Because what is happening in Gaza, where we see Russia is major beneficiary. Hamas leaders are in Moscow. There are statements. There are manipulation on this issue. There are rumors that these militants have been trained either in Iran or in Russia or in third countries, but with Russian advisors like Wagner Group, which is very active in this, as I said, in Africa, but also in this. So is the West ready for further confrontation with Russia, not only in Ukraine, but also in other regions? Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman here, and then, okay.
Hi, my name is Oliver Grimm. I'm the correspondent here in Brussels for the Austrian newspaper Die Presse. My question would be to you, how do you solve the problem that European policy vis-a-vis Russia is always sort of a smallest common denominator thing, which is we don't introduce sanctions until it's really necessary, until there are lots of loopholes, so everyone's happy. We introduce an exception for Bulgaria so they can keep importing Russian crude oil, but then we don't make sure that actually it's not being refined by a Russian-owned refinery and then resold, and so forth and so forth. How do you solve that? And I know the standard answer here by the good people of Brussels is, oh, we need to get rid of unanimity, but of course we're not going to get rid of unanimity. So lacking this, what needs to happen to change this? Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman here in the end.
Thank you for the great introduction. I'm Dan Russia from Corvus Communications. I would like to ask from the panel, who do you think are the best placed actors to convey the urgency of this message to the policymakers and to the population? I ask this question because when the situation started, people tended to put in the balance the kind of far threat of the far political threat and the far threat of an aggression with the very present and current threat of an energy crisis, of high inflation, and people put that in the balance, and we saw how the media reacted and how policymakers reacted, amplifying those threats that were the more urgent. I mean, the energy crisis and the threat of inflation, and let the policy threat linger in the background.
Thank you. So 3 questions. Exporting problems in other places to other places by Russia, smallest common denominator, and how to convey the message and to whom. So please, Keir.
Sure. On the first set of questions, let me agree with almost everything that you said. First of all, yes, the fact that the United States is going to have problems supporting Ukraine further has arrived faster than we expected. Everybody was looking to the potential for a Trump presidency as D-Day, after which all bets are off. Now it has come sooner as a result of a speaker replacement and now the block being put on funds. And of course, that reflects a very deep-seated view in some parts of the US political establishment that they shouldn't be supporting Ukraine at all, whether for their own domestic political objectives or because they simply do not understand the challenge. And that, of course, provides this environment where you see the whispering campaign in Western media, where you see the sources, the leaks, the people that are starting to build up the pressure on Ukraine to negotiate, not just in the United States, but those who think that the war should be brought to an end regardless of the consequences are finding their voices once again. It is inexplicable why the Biden administration, in addition to its self-deterrence, its reluctance to support Ukraine because of these entirely invented fears of nuclear escalation by Russia, has not explained to the American public that the figures that are put on aid to Ukraine are not dollars that are being taken from their tax bills and put directly into Zelensky's pocket. Instead, they are either being spent in the United States or notional figures for things that are being written off from US stocks and delivered to Ukraine instead of destroyed. It's a very simple message to get across. It is one that has completely been ignored and neglected by the United States. But on the core part of your problem, where I disagree with you is presenting the problems that Russia is creating in other parts of the world as a spin-off or a side effect of the war in Ukraine. It's not. It's part of the global conflict. It is a set of symptoms of the fact that Russia is pushing for advantage wherever it can. And very often, where it sees advantage is where there is a vacuum that it can exploit. If it's in Africa, the lack of interest of the former colonial power, a vacuum of rule of law, for example, a vacuum of security, all of these places are where Russia steps in because it can. Now, this is the complex of problems that European leaders have been quite slow to recognize, that this is not just about Ukraine. As I mentioned earlier, it is something that is happening across the board, and Russia will challenge Western interests and seek advantage wherever they can. So is Europe actually prepared to deal with this? Absolutely not. The recognition of the problem has come incredibly slowly, and there are no visible steps being taken to actually push back against this process of encroachment that has been going on for a number of years. So, yeah, it's seen. It's a process that we documented while it was happening. Russia's push for global influence starting in high gear from about 2018 onwards. We didn't know at the time why this was happening. Now we see the consequences as Russia taps into that support from the global south. We don't see any reaction from European political establishment to doing it. And that leads on to the second question. What exactly is how do you get around the challenge of this lowest common denominator if everybody has to agree on policy? And the only answer is those people that are not in that straitjacket doing what they can. And that means those countries that have policy leeway using it where possible to drag the others behind them. And there's a classic case study that you have there in terms of the actual supplies of weapons and weapon systems to Ukraine. As Nona listed, there was a shopping list of what Ukraine considered essential to carry out the counteroffensive during the earlier part of this year. It wasn't provided, or if it was incredibly late in homeopathic doses, with the result of those decisions is that the war is dragging on for more years than it needed to. Throughout that process, it was the UK that was out in front and dragging other countries, particularly the United States, but also Germany, behind them. Where there was an identified need that could be supplied by the US or by Germany, there was stalling, there was hesitation, there was timidity, there was fear of nuclear escalation until the UK stepped out in front and demonstrated that this could be done with no consequences. It happened with Challenger tanks, it happened with ATACMS, it happened in the very start of the invasion with NLAWs, with anti-tank missiles. The problem with that is that no individual country other than the United States can do it themselves alone. It takes a coalition effort because the UK can lead the way for as much as it wants with these very tiny numbers of pieces of equipment that they're supplying. But now The will is there, but the cupboard is bare because the UK has drawn down its own military capacity so thoroughly over the last 30 years that effectively it's all gone. So this is the point at which any other country that has the will and the capacity needs to step up. And we see that in the frontline states, in countries like Estonia and Latvia, donating not just individual pieces of equipment, but entire sectors of military capability to Ukraine, because there they are being used for the purpose for which they were bought in the first place. And there is the clear recognition that assisting Ukraine in defending itself against Russia is actually an investment in all of our security. Final question. I'm sorry, I've already gone on far too long about this. Who is best placed to convey the urgency? Well, I disagree very slightly with Mart, when he says we need to educate the public. No, we need to educate the leaders. Because, as Ernest mentioned, the polls among the public indicate that there is a recognition of the reality that we are facing. It is among the political classes that that recognition is so slow to take a hold. And the pattern we see over and over again is people learning through hard-won experience. There's an analogy here with the people that go to Moscow looking for resets. The people who troop over to the Kremlin, seeking some kind of common language with Putin, and come away hurt and disappointed and much wiser for the experience. Every single European leader has done that. But it is only after they recognize how futile this is that they start to listen to the people who were telling them all along that this was a terrible idea. Sadly, we have electoral cycles, so those people that have actually learned how to deal with Russia tend to disappear very rapidly. What we've seen is a process of the institutions within European capitals having this brought to the center of their attention sufficiently intensely and for a sufficiently long period that there has been a learning process now, and that the ignorance of Russia is no longer quite so profound. And in some respects, Russia is our best friend in that, because the worse horrors they inflict on Ukraine or elsewhere around the world, the easier it is for Western capitals to keep that in the front center of their attention. And so you don't have that instant loss of institutional memory that we've seen so often before. But it's the challenge that we're here for now. It's breaking out of the bubble from those who understand the problem to those for whom the problem simply does not fit within their frame of understanding of the world. Sorry, I've spoken for far too long.
Yes, starting with the US, so I'm not really in position to now analyze what will happen if Trump comes to power. Also, because I don't have a crystal ball, I mean, we have to deal with the very unpredictable politician like Trump. But let me remind you one example. Trump was the president who signed to send the javelins to Ukraine, unlike to Obama, who kept the veto on lethal arms sending to Ukraine. Now, on Russia and Russia creating the problems around the world in order to somehow to have more upper hand in Ukraine. Actually, Russia is creating the problems not now and not as a result of the war, but long ago. I mean, see Russia's interference in Brexit, in US elections, see the Skripal case on the UK, so see the explosion of arms deposit in Czech Republic, poisoning in Bulgaria, Russia's financing of radical left and radical right across the Europe, see all the disinformation, hybrid warfare it is conducted in order to exaggerate also the migration crisis issue in Europe. So Russia, I mean, they started to do this at least 10 years ago. I mean, Wagner was active in Africa already 10 years ago. But having said that, let's don't exaggerate also on Russia's ability and on Russia's strengths. And you mentioned Caucasus and you mentioned Armenia. So the Caucasus is the regions that Russia actually lost. And lost because Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is over. In a sense, over, I mean, of course, there is a long way in order to build confidence between Armenians and Azerbaijans, but it is the very first example how the post-Soviet conflict, which lasted for 30 years, has been resolved. I mean, Azerbaijan managed to retake all the lost territories, and Russia was completely absent there. Had no power to intervene, had no power to defend Armenia, even if it was obliged to defend Armenia. But especially in Armenia, this caused an enormous sense of betrayal. That's why Armenia is bringing now back all this discussion about European integration. That's why now Commission started to think how to transform SEPA, which was the document which Brussels signed with Yerevan back in 2013, when Yerevan was supposed to sign the association agreement with Brussels, and Putin in September 2013 called Sarkisian, then president of Armenia, in Moscow. They had like the joint press conference, and after 4 years of working on association agreement, Armenia was blackmailed, because Russia said to Armenia that if you sign the association agreement, I will not help you with Azerbaijan if Azerbaijan starts the war. And Armenia refused to sign association agreement. Now, actually, when Armenia has better democratic scores than Georgia, for example, was first to be satisfied with the SEPA, and of course now having no more Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia seeks more European integration, and the Commission starts to think how to transform SEPA into the association agreement back. So actually, this is the result of Russian weakness in the war on the Caucasus. And if we see how the talks of Tokayev also in the Central Asia, you see how Russia is weak actually also in Central Asia, but also with China. Now, here again, we try to exaggerate the partnership or the military alliance, which there is no military alliance between China and Russia, and we see China's no interest to build the new oil pipeline with the Siberia 2 pipeline with Russia, and we see the report of Gazprom published like 3 days ago that they will experiencing the huge losses, because of course they do not manage to compensate for the loss that they witnessed from European market, because China cannot absorb, especially with the same price the European countries used to pay for a long time. Another question, yes, you spoke about the strong confrontation between Zaluzhny and Zelensky. I think this is exactly what Russia wants us to disseminate, you know, because I mean, there were some alarms from the Ukraine side. They were making alarms. Attention! Now the new disinformation campaign is exactly this: to disseminate information that there is a confrontation between Zaluzhny and Zelensky. In reality, what Zaluzhny said that we are in the positional war with the perspective to be transformed in future in a stalemate. And right now I have enough manpower, but in the future this will be a problem for us in the war. Actually, Zelensky, what he has done, because he as a leader, of course, he has to deal also with the mood of the society, and he tried to convey the message to Ukrainian society, but also to the Western society, that the situation is not that bad, in a sense that, and we will try to give kind of the results of in this and during this counteroffensive. So actually there is no this real confrontation between Zelensky and Zaluzhny. The questions on sanctions, I don't know what to say, you know. I mean, I don't understand why we are speaking now to put the sanctions on the Russian diamond, where we could do it in the first round of sanctions. So you never know what is the logic behind the items the EU choose in order to introduce the sanctions. But I think that the most problem with sanction is to deal with the third parties. And you see that how, for example, the exports of Germany to Kyrgyzstan has been increased, and then you see how Kyrgyzstan increased its exports to Russia, and everything is clear now. So I think that this is the things to be addressed by Brussels and by Washington as well. I saw the information that now they also sanctioned some UK entrepreneurs that were kind of the violating sanctions, and the US decided to sanction also Turkish companies helping Russia to avoid sanctions. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. About the problems being exported elsewhere, I think we need to keep in mind that just as this war is not just about Ukraine, the global crisis is not just about Russia either. So we can see Russia's hand behind certain things, and they obviously try to meddle in all global conflicts that they think they might get some advantage out of. But we should also not forget that everyone else around the world also has agency. And whether it's a question of influence or whether it's a question of learning from what Russia is doing is something that I think political scientists will need to figure out, and probably retrospectively, because right now it's difficult to see through the fog of war and the fog of other things going on. The one silver lining, I would say, is that authoritarian regimes make very bad allies of each other. So these alliances that we see now emerging, they are not going to be durable, they are going to be tactical, they are not going to be lasting. You remember the alliance between the communist regimes of the USSR and China that didn't last very long either. About who do we need to educate, the public or the politicians, I think it's maybe a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Maybe we need to educate the public to demand more of the politicians, and maybe we need to educate the politicians to inform the public better. I don't know which way it goes. Obviously, they need to be brought in line in terms of the correct understanding of what's going on. It's interesting to think, Nona mentioned how Trump in some ways was better for Ukraine maybe than Obama. It's interesting that sometimes populist politicians indeed are better than coldly calculating politicians, because populist politicians are weak and they open to influence. And then it's the question of whether the right people are around to actually influence them in a way that would be good for anyone else. Who are the messengers to convey the seriousness of what's going on? Keir mentioned Eastern European states, and indeed they have been punching above their weight, I would say. They've been quite effective. The UK has also been an important ally, and it's very true that the UK has maybe got its very first Brexit benefit out of actually not being in the EU, because it has been able to exercise leadership in very crucial moments when it came to things like deliveries of tanks and long-range precision strike capabilities. But of course, as Keir was also saying, the UK capabilities are thin, and even thinner are those in Eastern Europe. So Poland is arming itself now in a serious way, but this can't be done very fast. It takes years. And the Baltic states, for example, also trying to buy all the off-shelf weapons they can, trying to get as good as deals as they can, but still it's going to take years. So there is will, but there is maybe lack of capability in Eastern Europe. And there is also a kind of willingness to speak truth to power that they have done very well, but there is a lack of will to listen to them. The kind of discourse we hear very often, or have been hearing very often over the last few years, is that we should have listened to the Baltics, we should have listened to Poland after 2014. Are you going to listen to them now? No, we are not. They are too hawkish. So the West is intent on remaking the same mistake over and over again. And there is only so much we can do about this in the end. Like, if you're not listened to, you can shout as much as you want, you're still going to fail to get your point across. Very depressing. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. There is a question over there. Okay, great. The last one. Mike, where's the mic? Where's the mic?
Hello, David Abiyago. I'm a journalist at Argus Media. I write a lot about energy, commodities. I'm also vice president of the press club. It's a language question, actually. If I listen to Keir use the word Western world, West, about once, but all the other speakers, non-native speakers, use the West, the West, the West. And it brings me to that point where part of the arguments that you make as well concern fertilizers, food, Russia's use and weaponization of energy and commodities, fertilizers and agricultural products outside in Africa, in India, and so on, very effectively. But using the word West, I was wondering if there's a better word somehow that you could. I think you used the word global South. You didn't say Africa, you didn't say developed world. So there's this understanding that we have to change our language. But this opposition between the West and Russia, isn't it more a democratic issue? It's more about people's rights, whether they're in, I don't know, Central Africa, to form policy and not have some Wagner unit come in and take over. I was wondering if you could sort of expand on the use of the word West. Who's actually involved? Is it wider? And those issues.
There's always pressure to change the terminology. I always use even Global South with a certain amount of trepidation because that offends people too. The problem is that they are instantly comprehensible labels for 99% of the people we're talking to. And you said, can we find another word for it? Well, nobody has done a satisfactory one yet. It's one of those things where you know it when you see it. And everybody understands that the West is not a geographical term, and some of the leading Western countries are actually in the South or the East, for example. It is more an academic debate than a practical one, I think, because we know what we're talking about. Most of the people that we're talking to know what we're talking about. And it is... when we get into the finer, abstruse discussions in the more left-leaning think tanks about whether you can offending people by counting them in or out of the West, the South, or whatever, that it becomes a problem, but not before then. On the fertilizer, commodity, food leverage, that is one of the prime indications of the point that I was making before about the progress that Russia had made in its campaigns around the world before anybody really noticed it was happening, except that those who were watching closely the campaign for global influence. The fact that Russia can interdict food supplies from Ukraine to countries in the Near East and Africa, which threatens their food security, and yet they don't blame Russia for it, is an indication of the successes and the inroads that they had made previously in terms of creating a worldview, a picture of what's happening in the world that was founded largely on disinformation and fiction rather than a realistic appreciation. Also, of course, on the economic leverage and the political leverage that they had established over that period. So it's just a symptom of the way in which, in this as in so many other things, the West, or the coalition of liberal democracies around the world that have a more or less shared view of what is right and what is wrong, and who stick up for the rules-based international order. And if anybody can come with a shorter formulation for that, I will be immensely grateful. They recognize what has happened, but they're coming from a standing start, and they haven't even started yet. And the challenge, even before we actually get to what to do about it, is, as we've been discussing for quite some time, how to get the political leaders beyond the frontline states to actually recognize what the problem is. On that particular point, yes, we mentioned the way in which the Baltic states, Poland, the frontline states, they've always been the troublemakers. They've always been the ones who are pointing at Russia as a problem. And even when vindicated, they're still the troublemakers. However, they do also provide a case study for how political leadership in any one given country can, in fact, grasp the challenge and make things happen. Because there is a pattern with all of the different threats that Russia presents, as soon as they are avowed, admitted, recognized by senior political figures within a given country, that sets other processes in motion. If you have a president, a prime minister, a defense minister saying we are under attack in whichever domain it may be, not military, but for example, energy, information, espionage, cyber, etc. Suddenly that allows other parts of that country, whether it's civil society, media, the rest of government, to actually start taking action. But it's that first admission by a key leader that actually unlocks the floodgates. And that is what is lacking in so many of the capitals that are to the west of Warsaw.
Let me take just one last question from the lady here, and we will be...
Journalist Secondist Corruption, Evelina Berezanska. I remember online webinar 2021, What's Leading Russia Away, Russia and Eurasia by Keir Gillis. Where Keir Gillis' words were prophetic. It was an important signal for everyone before the war. But now, war, it's difficult time for Ukraine. I know that Nona visit Ukraine. You were on tour with Yulia Bevzenko. My questions: if it were you people who were at war, what would you fight for the most? For example, if you. For example.
Okay, just briefly on the terminology. Know that when we refer, when we say the West, in order to refer to the conflict, actually, and to this war in particular, I think that the West comprehends actually the Ramstein meeting countries. And we know that at the Ramstein, where there are about the 50 participants, and they are from all over the world, are beyond what we can imagine geographic West, because in that we can see Jordan, Morocco, South Korea, Japan, and so on. So it goes also beyond the division, democratic, non-democratic countries, because also Tunisia is part of the Ramstein meetings, for example. And there was a attendance like Qatar as well, even if they don't want to be listed as officially members of the Ramstein meetings. Yes, I was in Ukraine in September. I made 2 trips. First of all, was focused on meeting the ordinary people and to see how the society from the grassroots is coping with the war. And the second meeting trip was the conference on EU accession forum, where the conference was focused to meet the official representatives of the government. So somehow I had this kind of the both dimension, perceived the war from the society and then how it is perceived by the government. And when I said in the beginning that it is difficult to speak about the negotiation because one of the party perceives the war as genocide, this is actually the feeling I got my first trip in Ukraine, because this is a story of immense suffering. One cannot even imagine. I mean, the feeling that I got is that the war that we are perceiving here in the West is completely different what the Ukraine is actually suffering on the ground. But then you see that the suffering in so much and the things that the Ukraine already sacrificed is so big that for them the only balsam for their suffering could be only victory. Because I cannot even imagine how that society could deal with not defeating Russia. And the sense I've got that for them, this is kind of really a colonial war, you know? This is kind of reviving all the tragedies of the whole century with Holodomor, with mass execution. And you see how they now all, from the grassroots levels, are trying to give a birth a new nation. And actually, what we are observing now, this is the real nation-building process in Ukraine, among the across the Ukrainian identity. So I think that, I mean, there is no other possible way for Ukrainians than to keep fighting until the end, because, you know, on the other side, there is a country. And from Ukrainians' perspective, it's a country who wants subjugate Ukraine. And it is not that there is a Putin who will be ever satisfied to take 3 or 5 regions, you know. Me personally, it was difficult for me even to ask the questions about the negotiation, because you see, they think Putin isn't here because of territorial gains. And then there is a problem of the people under the occupation, because sometimes in the West we portrayed it like, let's give this piece of territory to Putin and let's work on peace. But the people, they forget that on that piece of territory there are Ukrainian people living, and to live under occupation means torture and suffering. And those Ukrainians, for example, I met those in Bucha, who know very well what the occupation means, of course, and they tell you that we cannot live behind our compatriots and we cannot leave our people under the Russian suffering. So it's not only about the principles of territorial integrity, but it's about to liberate the people from the occupation.
Thank you. Mart, last remarks.
Some last remarks. I completely agree that by using certain words, we are primarily trying to be understood, not to offend anyone. And obviously, you know, people might be offended, as they're bound to be, some people at least, but the perfect terms have not been invented, and whichever ones we might come up with, they would be problematic, probably, in different ways. In this connection, I would point out that Eastern Europe, over the last 2 years, has somewhat changed its content as a term, has changed its reputation. Now you can be proud to be Eastern European in a way most people wouldn't be before February 2022. And Eastern European solidarity and its effects, I think, are some of the more sort of interesting and exciting and maybe more positive things to come out of what we have seen over the last 2 years. What we used to have was a constant competition between the Eastern European countries over who would be more westernized, who would be leaving their Eastern European legacy behind most effectively. We're not seeing that anymore, not to the same extent. So there is a kind of geopolitical, but also maybe a bit of a cultural reconfiguration going on in Eastern Europe that has been caused by Russia's war in Ukraine. And we will see what will come out of it. I also completely agree with the points about Ukraine not really being in a position to give up fighting, whatever the West decides, whatever we recommend, whatever Western politicians decide to do. Have a look at what happened in Eastern Europe after the Second World War. Did the fighting stop? No, it didn't. It continued. Maybe not in visible forms, maybe not in a way that was ultimately successful, but it definitely continued, and the instability continued, and suffering and torture and all of these things still continued. So peace is a misnomer in the sense that we might want to create peace, whichever negotiations or whichever territorial concessions we might come up with. This doesn't mean that peace will actually happen. And something I think we all need to realize that it will get worse before it gets better. It's going to be a prolonged conflict that will continue for a long time, and any quick resolution at this point seems very unlikely, at least to me.
Thank you very much. If I may, just for a couple of seconds, wrap it up. Are we ready to foot the bill? No, we are not. At least this is how we see it, although we would like it to be different. But definitely we know that there is a need for another approach in Europe, in the West, because of the challenge that are ahead of us. I'm afraid that I'm getting frustrated, even by this table we were talking about Western war fatigue, as if we were truly at war, kinetic war. But as a matter of fact, we are at war, which is ongoing. As I speak, probably dozens of institutions based here in Brussels are under attack from Russian hackers, North Korean hackers, whatever, whoever. But we pretend not to see it, and pretend that we can somehow, by some magic wand, create a reality where peace will emerge. And accepting, and it's not just westwards Warsaw. I mean, Poland, we have the same kind of feelings now about what would this war mean for the future of the country. Accepting that we are facing protracted conflict, war that would last years, it's difficult psychologically, cognitively it's difficult, but this is what we have to repeat to the people actually. There is no easy way out of it, in my opinion. And when I'm looking at Russian economy, which is on full war footing, when I'm observing developing in Russian education today, in Russian culture within the state, then, and I can imagine that Russia in 2 or 3 years from now on, then this picture becomes even more gloomy. So if we don't want to see it, then this will hit us in a very harsh way in years to come. So the responsibility of ours is to convey the message. Probably we need to do it more. I don't know how, but better to convince decision makers that it's up to them to do what is needed for the sake not of only of the West, of Ukraine, but the international security. So thank you very much for coming, for all of you, for watching as well. And especially please join me in thanking our panelists for their contribution to this discussion. Thank you. This is first but not the last thing we are going to organize here in Brussels, so probably next will come next year. So please, we will keep you in touch about our activities here in Brussels. So thank you.